The wildflowers trembled in Edwin Keating's rough, calloused hand as he knelt down to the small girl standing before him, her dark eyes wide, and searching his face with the kind of desperate hunger that only children possess. The kind that reaches straight into a man's chest and squeezes until he cannot breathe. She was maybe 4 years old, perhaps 5, and she was staring at the bundle of purple coneflowers and golden black-eyed Susans and delicate blue chicory blooms, as though he had just handed her the whole of the Arizona sky pressed flat and made fragrant. "Your mama picked these colors," Edwin said, and his voice broke on the last word in a way he had not expected, in a way that humiliated him and relieved him simultaneously. The little girl's lip quivered. Her name was Rose, and she had her mother's dark copper hair, her mother's stubborn chin, and her mother's devastating ability to look at a Texas Ranger and make him feel entirely unworthy of the badge pinned to his chest. "She did," Rose whispered. "Every single one," Edwin said. "She told me once that purple means strength. That gold means you keep going even when the ground is dry, and blue means you remember the sky even when the walls close in." Rose took the flowers with both small hands, cradling them the way she might cradle something sacred, and Edwin had to stand up quickly and turn away, because if he looked at that child's face for one more second, he was going to fall apart in the middle of the Pecos desert, and Texas Rangers did not fall apart in the middle of the Pecos desert. But none of this had started here, in this dry hollow of mesquite and red earth, with a child holding wildflowers and a man barely holding himself together. No. This had started 14 months ago in the town of Harlan Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, when Florence Winslow had walked into the jail where Edwin Keating was filing a report, and had looked him dead in the eye and told him that she needed absolutely nothing from him, "Thank you very much," and that she intended to handle the situation herself. He had not believed her then. He had been entirely wrong. Harlan Creek was the kind of town that had survived on stubbornness more than prosperity. It sat low in a wide basin between two scrub-covered ridges, with a single main street of packed dirt that turned to ankle-deep mud every time the Rio Bravo swelled in the spring, and a collection of cedar plank buildings that had weathered so many Texas summers they had the same bleached, exhausted look as the men who built them. There was a general store run by a man named Dunnigan who watered his whiskey and shorted his scales, a small church with a bell that had cracked 2 winters back, a livery stable, a telegraph office that received more bad news than good, and at the near end of the main street, the county jail and ranger post that Edwin Keating had occupied for 3 years. Edwin was 31 years old in the autumn of 1882. He had served as a Texas Ranger for 9 years, having been commissioned at 22 fresh from a cattle ranch outside San Antonio, where he had grown up working alongside his father, until a cattle thief's bullet had taken the older man when Edwin was 19. The badge had felt like justice. 9 years later, it felt like a life sentence he had chosen willingly and could not imagine abandoning, though there were nights when the emptiness of the post and the weight of everything he had seen pressed down on him like the full mass of the Texas sky. He was not an unhappy man, exactly. He was a precise man, a serious man, a man who kept his rifle clean and his word absolute and his heart at a careful distance from most things that could damage it. He had brown hair that the sun had burned to a dark amber at the temples, storm-colored eyes that the ranchers' wives in town called gray, but that shifted toward green when the light was right, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with the same uncompromising intention as the limestone ridges that bordered the basin. He was 6 feet and some change, broad through the shoulder, and he moved with the particular economy of someone who had spent years operating in spaces where unnecessary motion got people killed. He was also, though he would have denied this with considerable force, profoundly lonely. Florence Winslow arrived in Harlan Creek on the 2nd Thursday of October, 1882, on the stage from Del Rio, with a 4-year-old daughter, a trunk that weighed more than she did, and a letter of introduction to the town schoolteacher, a widow named Mrs. Caldwell, who had offered Florence the position of assistant schoolteacher through a correspondence that had taken 6 months to complete. Florence was 26 years old. She was not the kind of beautiful that announced itself loudly. She was the kind that built on you, that you noticed more completely with every passing day, like a landscape that reveals new details as the light changes. She had that dark copper hair, heavy and thick, usually pinned at the nape of her neck with a tortoise-shell comb that had belonged to her mother. Her eyes were a deep, serious brown that caught the light like polished mahogany and conveyed, depending on the moment, either great warmth or a formidable capability for stillness. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches, and she carried herself with the particular uprightness of someone who had learned early that posture was one of the few defenses available to a woman navigating a world that was not designed with her safety in mind. She wore a dark green traveling dress that was neat but showing wear at the cuffs, and she stepped off the stage and immediately looked around with the frank, assessing gaze of someone cataloging threats and resources in equal measure. Then she settled Rose on her hip, collected her trunk claim, and walked directly to the schoolhouse without asking directions from anyone. Edwin noticed her because it was his job to notice people arriving in town. He told himself this for approximately the first 3 days before admitting, at least privately, that he noticed her for other reasons entirely. The trouble with Florence Winslow, as he understood it from a careful distance, was that she had arrived in Harlan Creek with a dark past folded neatly into her trunk, alongside her teaching materials and her daughter's small dresses. The town knew this because towns always know things, and what Harlan Creek knew, or believed it knew about Florence Winslow was this: she was a widow, technically. Her husband, a man named Carl Winslow, had been found dead in the trading post he operated near Del Rio 18 months prior, a single gunshot wound to the chest, and though Florence had been cleared of any involvement by the deputy who investigated, cleared in that particular way that means everyone stops asking questions on paper, but never stops asking them privately. The whisper of it followed her the way whispers always follow women in 1882 Texas. Edwin did not believe she had killed Carl Winslow. He had met murderers. He knew what guilt looked like in a person's body, in the way they held their shoulders and avoided certain angles of direct gaze. Florence Winslow held her shoulders like someone carrying enormous weight and met every eye directly, and the combination told him a very different story. One about a woman who had survived something terrible and was now doing the stubborn, daily work of continuing to live. He learned the truth, or something closer to it, on the day she walked into his jail. It was a Monday morning in late October, cold enough for breath to show in the air but not yet cold enough for the heavy coats, and Florence came through the door of the ranger post without knocking, which was so unusual that Edwin looked up from his paperwork with genuine surprise. She was wearing a gray dress today, and her hair was down slightly looser than usual, and she had the look of someone who had been awake most of the night making a decision. "Mr. Keating," she said, and her voice was steady. "I need to report a threat." Edwin put down his pen. "Sit down, Miss Winslow." "Mrs. Winslow," she said, and the correction was automatic, reflexive, and carried in it a complicated mixture of insistence and grief that he filed away carefully. "Mrs. Winslow," he said. "Sit down." She sat straight-backed and placed her hands flat on her knees in a gesture that struck him as one of forced composure, and then she told him about Rafe Carden. Rafe Carden had been Carl Winslow's business partner, and Florence told Edwin with a directness that was clearly costing her something. The man who had killed Carl Winslow. Not with his own hands. He had arranged it, had employed a man named Decker to do the actual work, and then had positioned himself so carefully in the aftermath that the suspicion had fallen instead on the most convenient available target, which was the deceased man's young wife, who everyone knew had been unhappy in her marriage. She had been unhappy in her marriage because Carl Winslow had been a man of considerable cruelty, who had expressed that cruelty primarily in private, in the ways that left no visible marks, and Florence had spent 3 years of her life in a sustained exercise in surviving him quietly before his own business dealings had gotten him killed. She did not say any of this with self-pity. She said it with the dry, factual economy of a woman who had decided that the full truth was the only weapon she had left. Rafe Carden, she told Edwin, had tracked her to Harlan Creek. She had received a note 2 days ago, slipped under the door of the small house she was renting from Mrs. Caldwell's neighbor. The note had said, in language that was courteous on its surface and thoroughly threatening underneath, that Carden needed to discuss a business matter with her, that the trading post had left behind certain assets that he believed were owed to him, and that he was prepared to make things very difficult for a woman of her uncertain reputation if she was not cooperative. She had spent 2 days trying to decide whether to handle this herself or ask for help. She had clearly decided this morning that the threat was large enough to require assistance, though the look on her face told Edwin that asking for help was costing her considerably. "You made the right call coming here," Edwin said. "I made the only call available," Florence said, and the precision of the distinction told him a great deal about her. Edwin leaned back in his chair and looked at her steadily. There was a quality to her stillness that he was still cataloging, still figuring out how to account for in the calculus of who this woman was. She was afraid. He could see it in the fine tension at the corners of her eyes and the way her hands pressed flat against her knees as though applying pressure to a wound. But the fear was held under by something much stronger. He had seen that combination before. He had seen it in people who had been backed into corners so many times that fear had become something they knew how to work alongside rather than be consumed by. "Tell me everything you know about Carden," he said. "The business dealings, the trading post, whatever you have," she told him. She spoke for nearly an hour, and Edwin took notes and asked questions. And somewhere in the middle of it, he became aware that the conversation had shifted from the purely functional to something that also carried in it the weight of 2 people genuinely attending to each other. And he set that awareness aside because there were urgent matters at hand and he was a professional. But he did not forget it. In the days that followed, Edwin made quiet inquiries through the Ranger network about Rafe Carden. What came back confirmed the outline Florence had provided and added darker details. Carden was not simply a man with a financial grievance. He was a man with a pattern. He had been involved in at least 2 other deaths over the previous decade, both ruled accidental or self-inflicted, both in circumstances that bore the mark of careful arrangement rather than actual accident. He operated out of Del Rio and had connections that ran in 2 directions simultaneously, toward the legitimate merchant class who valued him as a trader, and toward the outlaws who valued him as a fence for stolen goods and an occasional organizer of considerably worse enterprises. The man named Decker who Carden had employed to kill Carl Winslow was also still active. This was the detail that concerned Edwin most, because Decker was a known hired gun who had worked across 3 states and was extremely good at what he did. Edwin reported this to Florence on a Thursday afternoon, meeting her at the schoolhouse after the children had gone home, because he had decided that the threat was serious enough to warrant full transparency, and that treating her as less than a full partner in her own safety would be both condescending and strategically stupid. Florence listened to everything without interrupting, her face controlled, and then she was quiet for a long moment. Rose was playing in the corner of the schoolroom with a rag doll and a set of wooden blocks, and Florence's eyes moved to her daughter and stayed there for a moment before coming back to Edwin. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We." The word registered somewhere in Edwin's chest with a warmth he did not entirely trust. "We wait for him to make his move and we're ready when he does," Edwin said. "But I want you to vary your routes. Keep Rose with you or with Mrs. Caldwell at all times, and tell me immediately if you receive any further communication from him." "I can also handle a firearm," Florence said. My father taught me. I have a Colt Navy revolver in my trunk." "Good," Edwin said, without hesitation, because in his experience a capable woman with a firearm was a capable woman with a firearm, and this was not the moment for Victorian sensibilities about what ladies were suited for. Florence looked at him for a moment with what he could only describe as reassessment, as though she had been expecting a different response and was revising some prior assumption. He noted it and moved on, because there was a great deal to organize. In the weeks that followed, Edwin found himself spending more time near the schoolhouse than his official duties strictly required. He told himself this was protective surveillance, which it was. He also told himself it was not anything else, which was less accurate. He began to know her in the incremental, irreversible way that happens when two people are thrown into proximity by circumstances, and then do not take care to maintain sufficient distance. He knew that she took her coffee black and drank it standing at the schoolhouse window, looking out at the street, with the expression of someone cataloging the day ahead. He knew that she read to Rose every evening from a collection of fairy tales, with covers so worn the titles had become illegible, and that she did different voices for different characters, with an unself-conscious commitment that made Rose shriek with delight. He knew that she had strong opinions about the poor quality of the geography textbooks available to the students of Harlan Creek, and had written a letter to the State Education Board that Mrs. Caldwell called the most eloquent piece of educational advocacy she had encountered in 30 years of teaching. He knew that she was funny not in a performance of wit, but in a dry, sudden way, an unexpected observation delivered in a deadpan that caught you entirely off guard. He knew that she was more formally educated than most of Harlan Creek, that she had attended a proper school in Austin through her 16th year, before circumstances had directed her away from formal education, and that she carried this knowledge quietly, without using it as a social weapon. He knew that she watched him when she thought he was not looking, and that the expression on her face when she did so was one he did not have adequate vocabulary for but which caused him considerable internal disruption. November arrived with a cold front that dropped the temperature across the basin and set the ranchers to worrying about an early winter. Harlan Creek pulled inward, as small towns do in the cold, and the close quarters of the season created a kind of enforced intimacy that both accelerated some things and made others more difficult to ignore. Rafe Carden arrived on a Tuesday evening on the same stage line Florence had come in on, and Edwin was at the stage depot because he had been watching for him. Carden was a tall man, lean, 50 or so, with a quality of courteous menace that Edwin had encountered before in men who had learned to conduct their cruelties efficiently. He wore a good suit and carried a leather traveling case and looked, at first inspection, like a successful merchant on legitimate business. He registered at the hotel without incident, ate dinner in the hotel dining room, and retired early. Edwin watched all of this from a careful distance and felt the shift in the air that came when a situation that had been potential became actual. The next morning, Carden walked to the schoolhouse. Edwin was already there. Carden stopped on the schoolhouse steps and looked at Edwin with the particular calculation of a man accustoming himself to an obstacle. Edwin stood with his arms loose at his sides and his ranger badge visible and his expression professionally neutral. "Ranger Keating," Carden said, pleasantly, reading the badge. "Don't suppose you'd be here coincidentally." "No," Edwin said. "I'm here to see Mrs. Winslow about a private business matter." "Mrs. Winslow does not wish to speak with you. You're welcome to communicate through legal counsel. If you have documentation for any financial claim relating to the estate of Carl Winslow, the county court in Del Rio is the appropriate venue." Carden's pleasant expression did not change, but something shifted underneath it, something cold and calculating. "That's not quite how simple matters need to be handled." "It is, in fact, exactly how they need to be handled," Edwin said. "I want to be very clear with you, Mr. Carden. I have made inquiries. I know considerably more about your affairs than you may be comfortable with. Any further contact with Mrs. Winslow that is not conducted through proper legal channels will result in immediate arrest on harassment grounds, and I will be simultaneously forwarding a report to my captain in San Antonio detailing my findings regarding your involvement in the death of Carl Winslow." The pleasant expression went away entirely. Beneath it was the face of the actual man, which was something considerably less agreeable. "You have no evidence," Carden said, and his voice had gone quiet. "I have enough to make your life very complicated," Edwin said. "That tends to be sufficient." They looked at each other for a long moment in the cold November morning, and then Carden picked up his traveling case and walked back toward the hotel. Edwin went inside and found Florence standing just beyond the door, where she had clearly been listening. She was pale and her hands were pressed together in front of her, and when she looked at Edwin, there was something in her face that he had not seen there before. Not the managed strength, not the careful composure, but something raw and genuine and grateful, and also, he thought, frightened in a way that had less to do with Rafe Carden and more to do with whatever was happening between them. "Thank you," she said, and the two words came out quietly and carried the full weight of everything she meant by them. "It's not over," he said. "He's not the kind of man who takes no for an answer the first time." "I know," Florence said, "but still, thank you." She reached out and touched his arm just briefly through his jacket sleeve, and then she turned and went back to her students, and Edwin stood for a moment in the cold schoolhouse entry and tried to remember what he had been planning to do next. He walked back to the jail thinking about her hands pressed together, thinking about the way she had said thank you as though it cost her something, and she was paying it anyway. Carden, as Edwin had predicted, did not leave. He stayed in Harlan Creek for 3 more days, moving quietly and observing things, and on the second of those days Decker arrived. Edwin recognized him from the description he had received from his ranger network, a compact, pale man with sandy hair, and a stillness about him that was not the stillness of patience, but the stillness of a loaded mechanism waiting for its trigger. The presence of Decker changed the calculation significantly. Decker was not here for legal harassment. Decker was here because Carden had decided that the asset he was after, whatever financial documentation or trading post records Florence possessed that could either be used against him or had value he wanted to claim, was worth escalating to force to obtain. Edwin dispatched a telegraph to his captain in San Antonio that evening, requesting reinforcement, and then spent that night in the jail with his rifle across his knees, going through the problem from every angle. What he landed on was a plan with 2 components. The first was operational. He needed to move Florence and Rose to a safer location within the town while creating the appearance that they were still at the schoolhouse house. The second was informational. He needed to know exactly what documents or records Florence had that Carden considered worth this much risk, because understanding what the man was after was the only way to understand how to end this. He went to Florence the next morning and laid it out for her. She listened without interrupting, and he noticed again this quality of hers, the absolute quality of her attention when she was thinking, the way she gave the problem her full focus with no deflection. "The documents," she said when he had finished, "you need to know what they are." "Yes." Florence was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Carl kept ledgers." 2 sets of ledgers, one for the legitimate business, one for the other business, which was fencing stolen stock, primarily horses, for a network that included Carden. "I took the second set of ledgers when I left Del Rio. I did not know what to do with them. I was afraid that if I went to the authorities they would use them to implicate me as well, since I was, after all, present in that post for 3 years. But I kept them because I thought they might protect me someday. A hidden motive of my own, I suppose. Where are they?" "In my trunk under the false bottom." Edwin took a breath. "Those ledgers implicate Carden directly, in the horse theft network extensively. And there is a payment record in Carl's hand for a man described only as D, which I believe refers to Decker, dated 3 weeks before Carl was killed. I think Carl was setting up his own murder because he had somehow angered Carden, and Carden was making him participate in the arrangements for it, which was Carden's method of ensuring silence. The horror of this was visible on her face for just a moment, a flash of the full terrible weight of being married to a man capable of being implicated in his own death, and then she controlled it again. "Those ledgers are evidence of a capital crime," Edwin said. "If we get those to my captain in San Antonio, Carden is finished." "Then we need to get them to your captain in San Antonio," Florence said. "How do we do that without Decker knowing?" They worked out the plan together, at the schoolhouse table with Rose asleep in the corner, their heads bent close over a piece of paper on which Edwin sketched the layout of the town and the roads out. Florence contributed specific details about the ledger's condition and location that Edwin needed, and they moved efficiently through the problem, and at one point their hands came very close over the paper and neither of them moved away, and the moment stretched out, and then Florence said, quietly, "Edwin," and it was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice was something he felt in his entire body. He looked up from the paper. The look on her face was complicated and honest and asking something she had not yet put into words, and Edwin, who was a man of considerable self-discipline and was also a man who had been fighting this for weeks, said nothing for a moment and then said, "When this is over." "When this is over," Florence said, and it was an agreement and also a promise. They moved the ledgers that night. Edwin carried the false-bottom trunk section himself, wrapped in a saddle blanket, to the telegraph office after midnight, where he arranged with the operator, a reliable man named Hodges who owed Edwin a significant favor from a prior difficulty, to have the relevant pages copied and transmitted in cipher to San Antonio. The originals went with a rider, a young ranger trainee named Petties who Edwin trusted, heading east on the Del Rio Road at 4 in the morning. By noon the next day, Edwin had a telegraph response from his captain confirming receipt of the information and indicating that warrants would be drawn within 24 hours. He also had word that 2 additional rangers were en route from San Antonio, expected to arrive in 2 days. The problem was that 2 days was a long time if Carden and Decker decided to move before then. They moved that night. Edwin had stationed himself at the small house where Florence and Rose were staying, in the room that faced the street, and he was awake and at the window when he heard the sound, not dramatic, not the creak of a floorboard or the breaking of glass, but the very soft sound of someone who was good at this work moving along the side wall of the house. He was through the connecting door to Florence's room before the sound had fully registered, and Florence was already awake, sitting up in the dark with her Colt Navy in her hand and Rose pressed against her side. And in that moment, in the flickering lantern light from the street outside, with her copper hair loose around her shoulders and her face absolutely steady, and the child tucked against her, Edwin thought that he had never seen anything in his life quite like this woman, this specific remarkable woman. And the feeling was so large it had nowhere to go. He held up one hand to indicate she should stay, and she gave him a single nod that communicated, with perfect economy, that she understood and was ready. He was out the window and around the back of the house in 30 seconds, and he came around the corner and found Decker 3 feet from the rear door with a set of lockpicks in his hand. Decker was fast. He had the picks away and a revolver coming up in less than a second, and Edwin had his own weapon drawn, and they stood in the cold dark with firearms pointed at each other, and the only sound was the distant bark of a dog and the wind through the mesquite. "Put it down," Edwin said. Decker's face was expressionless and calculating. He was, Edwin could see, running the mathematics of the situation, the ranger badge, the steadiness of Edwin's hand, the question of whether he could get a shot off before Edwin could, the answer to which was almost certainly no. Decker put the revolver down. He ran, which Edwin had expected, and Edwin did not chase him into the dark because he did not leave Florence and Rose alone to do so. He retrieved Decker's revolver and went back to the front of the house and found Florence on the front step in her robe with her Colt in her hand, scanning the street with exactly the right professional calm, and behind her in the doorway Rose was sitting up wrapped in a quilt looking frightened but contained. "Decker," Florence said. "Gone. Carden's going to know the approach failed." Edwin looked up and down the dark street. "I need to get you both somewhere else tonight." "Where?" "The jail," he said. "It's the most defensible building in town, and I can lock the door." She agreed without argument, and 20 minutes later she and Rose were settled in the back room of the ranger post, which was ordinarily used for storage but which Edwin had arranged with a blanket and his own bedroll for Rose and the office chair padded with his coat for Florence. And Rose was asleep again almost immediately with that merciful resilience children have. And Florence sat in the lamplight and looked at Edwin across the small space. "You could have been shot tonight," she said. "Occupational reality," he said. "Don't diminish it," she said, and there was something sharp in her voice that was not anger but something adjacent to it, something that sounded like fear operating as feeling. "All right," he said. "I could have been shot tonight. I was not. You and Rose are safe." Florence looked at her hands. "I have spent," she said carefully, "a great deal of my adult life being afraid, not of physical danger specifically, though there was that too, afraid of the next thing that would be taken, the next door that would close." She looked up. "I do not want to be afraid anymore." "You're not afraid," Edwin said. "I've been watching you for 6 weeks, Florence. You're the least frightened person I've met in 9 years of this work. That's not I feel afraid constantly. Afraid and frightened are different things. Afraid is what you feel. Frightened is what you do with it. You feel the fear and you act anyway. That's courage." She looked at him for a long time in the lamplight, and the expression on her face was the one he had been trying to find words for since October, and he thought he had found the words now. She looked like someone who had been very careful for a very long time and was considering, with full understanding of the risk involved, being less careful. He crossed the room to the chair where she was sitting and crouched down so they were level, and she looked at him with those serious dark eyes, and he said, "When this is over," I said. "You did," she said. "Well, it's almost over." "It's not over yet," she said, and there was something almost like a smile in her voice. "No," he agreed. "Not yet." He did not kiss her, though the distance between them was small and the moment was asking him to. He stayed where he was, looking at her, and what passed between them in that moment was something that did not require the action, something that was its own complete event. Then he stood up and took his position at the door of the jail and watched the street through the long cold hours until morning. Carden attempted to leave town at dawn. He had his horse saddled and his case packed and was making for the eastern road, and Edwin was waiting at the edge of town with his rifle and the knowledge of the warrants incoming from San Antonio, and it was not, in the end, a complicated arrest. Carden was a man who had succeeded for decades through careful arrangement and the use of other men's hands, and when the arrangement failed and the other man was gone and the ranger was standing in the road, he calculated his odds and surrendered with the practiced cooperation of someone who knew that cooperation was the best remaining strategy. Decker was found the following day hiding in a dry wash south of town by the 2 rangers who arrived from San Antonio, and the warrants that came with them covered both men thoroughly. The ledgers arrived safely in San Antonio. Carden was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, theft of livestock across state lines, and a comprehensive list of additional offenses that would keep the courts busy for a considerable time. Decker was charged with the murder of Carl Winslow, which solved, in the brutal, insufficient way that courts sometimes solve things, the mystery that had shadowed Florence Winslow since she had been cleared of it 18 months before. The shadow lifted publicly as well as legally. The telegraph lines carried the story efficiently, and the men who had brought their suspicions to Harlan Creek in October were forced to revise them in November, which several of them did with considerably less grace than the situation deserved. Mrs. Caldwell told Florence in the firm and matter-of-fact way that good women sometimes speak truth to power that Anyone who had doubted her had revealed more about themselves than about Florence. And Florence received this with the composed gratitude of a woman who had been waiting for it to be said. The resolution of the immediate danger left Harlan Creek in that curious suspended state of aftermath, where everything that had been held in tension releases all at once and leaves the people involved in it slightly stunned, slightly unsure what to do with their hands now that the crisis is gone. Edwin wrote his report. He filed the paperwork. He attended to the dozen small administrative tasks that had accumulated over the past weeks of operational focus. And then he stood at the window of his jail on a cold November afternoon and looked down the main street of Harlan Creek at the schoolhouse at the far end, and felt the loneliness of the place settle back around him like a familiar coat, and realized that this was not tolerable anymore in the same way it had been before Florence Winslow arrived. He went to the schoolhouse on a Saturday morning when there were no students, and Florence was there alone, reorganizing the bookshelf, because apparently the immediate resolution of a serious threat to her life did not prevent her from caring deeply about the condition of the geography textbooks. She heard him come in and turned, and she had a book in each hand and her hair was half undone from its pin, and there was a streak of dust on her cheek from the shelf, and the ordinary realness of her in that moment hit Edwin like a physical force. "The case is closed," he said. "I heard," she said. "Congratulations." I said when it was over. Florence put both books down very deliberately on the desk in front of her. She looked at him with full attention and without deflection, the way she did everything. "You did," she said. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," Edwin said. "In my experience, directness causes less damage than the alternative, so I'm going to be direct now. I care about you, Florence, more than is strictly compatible with professional detachment, which I gave up trying to maintain approximately 6 weeks ago. I care about Rose. I think about your welfare and your happiness with a frequency that is not consistent with ordinary professional concern, and I think you should know that." Florence looked at him steadily. "That was quite direct," she said. "I said it would be." "Edwin," she said, and again that particular sound of his name in her voice undid him. "I have been telling myself for 6 weeks that whatever I felt was gratitude and proximity and the manufactured intimacy of shared danger. I have been telling myself this with diminishing success. And currently I believe none of it. Currently I believe that I have met, against all reasonable expectation, in a town I had never heard of before July of this year, a man who is genuinely worth knowing, who has been honest with me when honesty was costly, who has never treated me as a liability or a burden or a problem to be managed, who treated my daughter with kindness as a matter of course and not as a performance." She stopped. Her eyes were bright. "I am still afraid, Edwin." "I told you that. I know. But I meant what I said. I don't want to be afraid anymore." He crossed the room to her, and this time there was nothing preliminary about it. He cupped her face in both his hands gently, and she looked up at him with her whole self present in her eyes, no portion of it withheld, and he kissed her in the dusty morning light of the Harlan Creek schoolhouse with all the directness he had promised. She kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything present, fully committed, no part of her absent from the experience, and the dust motes drifted in the pale November sunlight around them, and the schoolhouse was entirely silent except for the far-off sound of the church bell, cracked as it was, marking the hour. December arrived, and Edwin Keating found himself navigating the unprecedented territory of being in love in a small town where everyone was watching. Harlan Creek had strong and divergent opinions about the ranger and the schoolteacher, and these opinions were expressed through the various channels available to a small frontier community, loaded remarks in the general store, speculative conversations at the church social. A letter from the county sheriff, suggesting that romantic entanglements might compromise Edwin's professional standing, that Edwin read twice, and then placed in the category of letters not worth responding to. None of it made any material difference. Florence and Edwin were not a secret exactly, but they were private, and the distinction mattered to both of them. They took their time with each other in the way of people who had both had their expectations of trust damaged by prior experience, and who were therefore invested in building this particular thing carefully, on a foundation that would hold. He spent Sunday afternoons at Mrs. Caldwell's neighbor's house, where Florence and Rose still resided, and these afternoons had a quality that Edwin had not encountered before in his adult life. A quality of settled comfort, of the particular pleasure of ordinary shared time with people whose company you find genuinely nourishing. Rose, who had regarded him with the careful assessment of children who have learned to evaluate adult intentions, had decided by the second week of December that he was trustworthy, and she communicated this decision by climbing into the chair next to him and handing him a wooden block and asking him to build something, which he did with a seriousness that made Florence laugh from the doorway. He loved Florence's laugh. He had not heard it often. She was not a woman who deployed it casually, but when something genuinely moved her to it, it was whole and unreserved and completely unguarded, and it was the most beautiful thing he had heard in his considerable time on this earth. He told her this one evening in December, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who had received a gift they had not expected to receive. And then she said, "Edwin Keating, you're going to make this very complicated for me." "I intend to," he said. Christmas came to Harlan Creek with a cold snap and a light snow that was unusual enough for the Texas basin to cause significant excitement among the children of the town and considerable inconvenience to everyone else. The church put on a program, and Florence's students performed a series of recitations that she had been drilling them on for 3 weeks, and Rose sat in the front pew between Edwin and Mrs. Caldwell and watched the whole proceeding with round-eyed concentration, and at one point she took Edwin's hand without looking at him and held it for the duration of the candle lighting, and he sat very still with her small hand in his and felt something settle in him so deeply and completely that it was almost physical. He spoke to Florence that night after the Christmas program when they were walking back to the house through the snow-dusted street with Rose asleep on his shoulder, her head heavy and her breathing deep and even. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that there is no correct answer, and I mean that genuinely." "The answer has to be what's true for you." Florence looked up at him. "That is an extremely alarming preamble." "I know, I'm sorry," he paused. "I'm asking you to marry me, Florence. Not because it's the appropriate next step, not because the town expects it, not for any reason other than that I want to spend my life with you and with Rose. But I understand if—" "Yes," Florence said. He stopped walking. "That was fast." "I have been thinking about this for approximately 3 weeks," she said. "I arrived at yes some time ago, and have been waiting for you to get there." He looked at her in the dark street with the snow coming down around them and Rose breathing quietly against his shoulder, and the feeling in his chest was so large it had no adequate expression. So he just stood there for a moment being entirely in it, and Florence watched him with that look of hers, warm and honest and entirely present. And then she stepped close and leaned against his free arm, and they walked the rest of the way to the house like that, without speaking, because there was nothing that needed saying. They were married in February of 1883 at the Crackbell Church in Harlan Creek, on a day that was cold and clear with the kind of February sky that Texas does sometimes, so blue it seems unreal, so enormous it seems to contain everything. Mrs. Caldwell stood with Florence. Edwin's captain, who had ridden up from San Antonio expressly for the occasion, stood with Edwin and told Florence afterward that in 9 years of working with Edwin Keating, he had never seen the man smile the way he smiled in that church, and Florence said she intended to see that he smiled like that as often as possible, and the captain said that he believed her entirely. Rose, in a white dress with a blue sash that matched the February sky, stood between them both and watched the ceremony with the particular solemnity of a 5-year-old taking important proceedings very seriously, and when the minister pronounced them married, she turned to Edwin and said, with great gravity, "Does that mean you live with us now?" and the church erupted in the kind of genuine, unperformed laughter that churches are rarely lucky enough to hear. "That's what it means," Edwin confirmed. "Good," Rose said and took his hand. Spring came early that year, March arriving with a rush of green across the basin, and the wildflowers coming up through the limestone cracks and the low brush along the creek beds in a riot of color that was one of the great annual events of the Texas Hill Country. The coneflowers and the Indian blankets and the bluebonnets and the black-eyed Susans transformed the dry gray-brown landscape into something that stopped you cold when you came over a rise and saw it laid out below. Florence loved the wildflowers with a completeness that moved Edwin every time he witnessed it. She had grown up in Austin, she told him, in a family that had very little but had lived close to the land, and her mother, who had died when Florence was 12, had known every flower by name and had walked her through the hill country every spring pointing them out and explaining them, the way they adapted to the dry heat, the way they seated themselves across the limestone, the way the colors came up brighter after a wet winter. The knowledge had been a gift, intimate and irreplaceable, and Florence carried it the way she carried everything that mattered to her quietly, carefully, with her whole heart. One March Sunday, when the wildflowers along Harlan Creek were at their peak, Edwin rose early and walked down to the creek while Florence was still asleep and Rose was dreaming, and he gathered a large bunch of them, choosing carefully, going for the specific colors he had heard Florence describe when she talked about this place. The purple of the coneflowers, the gold of the black-eyed Susans, the deep, reliable blue of the chicory. He brought them back to the house and put them in the ceramic pitcher on the kitchen table, and when Florence came into the kitchen and saw them, she stopped in the doorway and put her hand over her mouth and stood there for a moment in a stillness that was not her professional composure but something more fragile and more real. "Edwin," she said, finally. "Your mother's colors," he said. "You described them once. I wanted you to have them." She crossed the kitchen and held his face in her hands and kissed him with such intensity and such gratitude and such love that he had to grip the kitchen table behind him to keep his balance, and when she pulled back her eyes were full and she was laughing slightly, which was what she did when she was most moved, he had learned. "I love you," she said. "I love you enormously and thoroughly, and I need you to know that." "I know it," he said. "I love you the same way." Rose appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, her hair a magnificent chaos, and looked at the flowers and then at her parents. "Are we celebrating something?" she asked. "Spring," Florence said. "And your father is very attentive to detail." "What does attentive mean?" "It means he pays attention," Edwin said. "I pay attention," Rose said, with dignity, and went to examine the flowers. The spring and summer of 1883 were the best months of Edwin's life. He understood this while they were happening, which was fortunate, because the tendency was to understand such things only in retrospect. He understood it in the evenings when Florence sat on the porch in the fading light reading, while Rose caught fireflies in a jar. He understood it on Saturday mornings, when the three of them rode out to the creek and Florence waded barefoot in the shallow water with her skirts hiked to her knees and Rose screamed with delight at the minnows, and Edwin sat on the bank with the contented purposelessness of a man who has arrived somewhere he meant to be. He understood it in the ordinary dailiness of it, in the breakfast table and the evening fire, and the particular texture of his life now that it contained these two specific people. He also understood it in the significant and slightly terrifying developments of that summer, which arrived in the form of Florence's quiet announcement in June that they were expecting a child. Edwin received this news in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning and then sat down rather suddenly in the kitchen chair, and Florence looked at him with an expression that contained both amusement and a slight uncertainty, and he said, This is not bad sitting down. This is very good sitting down." And she laughed with her whole body and came and sat in his lap and put her arms around him, and he held her close and thought about the size of the future that was opening ahead of them. Rose, when told, went through a series of rapid emotional responses. Initial suspicion, extended questioning about logistics, a phase of intense calculation regarding sleeping arrangements, and ultimately a declaration that if it was a boy she wanted to name him after the black horse at the livery stable, whose name was Devil, and that if it was a girl she had no opinions at this time. Florence's pregnancy proceeded through the dry heat of the Texas summer, and Edwin found himself in the entirely new territory of being a worrying man. He was not professionally a man given to excess anxiety. 9 years as a Texas Ranger required a relationship with danger that was functional rather than catastrophic. But the domestic vulnerability of it, the beloved person in his care, and the irreversible weight of the life being built, produced a quality of care in him that sometimes manifested as checking too many times that the window latches were secure, or arriving home from the jail rather faster than strictly necessary when his shift was over. Florence found this simultaneously endearing and exasperating, and told him so with the directness that was characteristic of her. "Edwin," she said one evening in August, when she had caught him checking the wood supply for the 3rd time in a week, "you cannot protect me from childbirth by ensuring that we have adequate firewood." "I know," he said. "I am not fragile. I know that better than anyone. Then stop hovering and come sit with me." He came and sat with her, and she took his hand and put it against her rounded middle, and the child moved against his palm with a startling, assertive reality that stopped his breath entirely, and Florence watched his face go through its transformation, and smiled at him with the expression he loved most, the one that was entirely warm and entirely real and entirely for him. "There," she said. "Feel better?" "Yes," he said, which was true. He felt better, and also more afraid, and also more completely invested in the continued existence of the world than he had ever been in his life, and these were not contradictory states. In October of 1883, exactly 1 year after Florence had walked into Edwin's jail with her straight back and her flat hands and her dark past, and her hidden motive and her devastating competence, Florence gave birth to their son. The birth was long and hard, attended by the doctor and by Mrs. Caldwell, and Edwin spent most of it in the front room of the house, being entirely useless, which was one of the more humbling experiences of his adult life. When Mrs. Caldwell came out and told him he had a son and that Florence was tired but well, he sat down on the floor of the front room and stayed there for several minutes, which seemed like the appropriate response to the situation. The boy was named Henry Winslow Keating, because Florence insisted on keeping Winslow in it, which Edwin agreed to immediately because the name belonged to her, and she was choosing to extend it to their son, and that was its own form of healing. Rose, whose real opinions on the matter of a sibling had been difficult to assess in advance, took one look at Henry on the day he was brought home and announced that he was hers, by which she clearly meant that she considered herself responsible for him. And she demonstrated this from the first week by arriving at his cradle whenever he cried and singing to him with the unself-conscious dedication of a 6-year-old who has decided something is important. Edwin watched this and felt something that had no name but was related to the feeling of arriving somewhere after a very long journey. Not relief exactly, arrival. The winter of 1883 folded itself around the Keating family with the particular warmth of a house that has people in it, and Edwin settled into the rhythm of a life that was multiple things simultaneously. The ranger's post with its demands and its occasional dangers, the domestic life of a household with an infant and a 6-year-old, and a woman whose intelligence and capabilities continued to reveal themselves in new ways with every passing month. Florence went back to teaching when Henry was 3 months old. Mrs. Caldwell had argued for longer, and Florence had listened with respect and then done what she was going to do anyway, which was walk to the schoolhouse and open it up and continue educating the children of Harlan Creek, because it was necessary work, and she was good at it, and she had been educated for something, and she intended to use it. Edwin brought her lunch on Tuesdays because it was his day off, and because walking to the schoolhouse in the noon light to find her in the middle of some demonstration or explanation, and watch her be brilliant at the thing she was built for, was one of the reliable pleasures of his week. Spring came around again, and the wildflowers came up along Harlan Creek, and Edwin went down to the creek on a March Sunday morning the way he had done the previous year, and he gathered the same colors, the purple coneflowers, the gold black-eyed Susans, the deep blue chicory, but this time Rose was awake and came with him, tramping alongside him through the wet grass in her boots, serious and attentive, watching him choose the flowers. "Why those ones?" she asked. "Your mama loves these colors," he said. "Why?" He hesitated, and then he made a decision, because Rose was 6 and old enough to hold some of the story, and because Florence's mother deserved to be known. "Your grandmother, your mama's mother, who died before you were born, she knew every flower in Texas by name. She walked your mama through the wildflowers every spring when she was small. These were her colors. Purple means strength, gold means you keep going, blue means you remember the sky." Rose was quiet, absorbing this. She looked at the flowers in Edwin's hand with a new expression, an expression of recognition and inheritance. "Can I carry some?" she said. "Of course." He divided the bunch, and they walked back to the house together, Rose holding her portion with both hands and extraordinary care. And when they came inside, Florence was in the kitchen with Henry on her hip, and she turned and saw them both, husband and daughter, each carrying wildflowers in the same colors. And her face did the thing that it did when she was most moved, that particular crumpling and brightening that was joy and grief and gratitude all at once. Her mother's colors brought home by the people she loved most. She put Henry down very carefully on his blanket and went to Rose first, crouching to her daughter's level, and Rose held out her portion of the flowers with both hands. "Papa said these were your mama's colors," Rose said. "He said she taught you the flowers." Florence's eyes filled. She took the flowers from Rose and held them against her chest and pulled her daughter into a close embrace that Rose accepted with the full-bodied commitment she brought to physical affection. "She did," Florence said. "She knew every single one." "I want to learn them," Rose said into Florence's shoulder. "Then I'll teach you," Florence said. "Every single one, just like she taught me." Edwin watched this from the doorway and felt the full weight of what had been built here, not despite the dark past, and the hidden motives, and the forced choices, and the danger and the loss, but out of it, built from the raw materials of difficult things into something that was genuinely and durably good. Florence looked up at him over Rose's head, and her eyes were still full, and she smiled at him with her whole face, and he crossed the kitchen and stood the way he had become accustomed to standing, close to her, his hand finding its familiar place at the small of her back. "Your mama picked these colors," he said to Rose, whose face was still pressed against Florence's shoulder. Rose lifted her head and looked at the flowers and then at her mother. "I know," she said. "Papa told me. I'm going to learn all of them." "You'll know everyone before summer," Florence promised. Henry, from his blanket on the floor, made the authoritative declarative sound of a 7-month-old, who felt that sufficient attention had been directed away from himself. And Rose detached herself from Florence and went to kneel beside her brother with the proprietary air of the older sibling. And Florence stood up, still holding the wildflowers against her chest, and looked at Edwin with an expression that was something he had been accumulating vocabulary for over the course of more than a year, and that he now understood fully. It was the expression of a woman who had been through the dark country and arrived in the light, and knew the difference between them and therefore knew the precise value of what she had. It was an expression that required the dark country to exist, that was only possible because of everything that had been survived to get here. "Thank you," she said, the same 2 words she had said to him in the schoolhouse in October, but entirely different now, carried in an entirely different vessel, weighted with everything that had accumulated between then and this spring morning with the wildflowers and the children and the life built. "Always," Edwin said. She leaned up and kissed him gently, and he held her close, and in the kitchen of their house in Harlan Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1884, with the wildflowers in a ceramic pitcher on the table, and the children on the floor and the Texas sky doing its enormous work outside the window. Edwin Keating was entirely and specifically and completely where he needed to be. The years that followed built themselves one upon the other with the accumulating density of a life well and genuinely lived. The ranger post at Harlan Creek remained Edwin's for another 4 years, during which time the town grew incrementally. A second general store, a doctor's office, a proper bank, and the school where Florence taught grew with it, adding a second room and a second teacher in 1885. And Florence took on the role of head teacher with the same quiet efficiency she brought to all her undertakings. Rose turned 8 and then 9 and then 10 and continued to learn the wildflowers. By the time she was 9, she could name every species in the Harlan Creek basin by sight and tell you their blooming season and their preferred soil conditions and their folk medicinal uses. A body of knowledge she had assembled through Florence's teaching and through her own considerable curiosity. Spending hours on the creek banks with a wildflower guide she had received for her 8th birthday from Edwin, ordered specially from a bookshop in San Antonio, pressed carefully, and annotated in a journal she kept for the purpose. Edwin watched his stepdaughter's passion for this knowledge with a specific quiet joy that was particular to its origins. This girl, learning her grandmother's language for the land, carrying forward something that might otherwise have been lost when Florence's mother died. The inheritance was not through blood alone, but through attention, through the deliberate choice to pass something on, and it seemed to him one of the most important things he had witnessed. Henriette, too, was a compact, determined person with Florence's serious eyes and Edwin's stubbornness, who had developed the habit of following Edwin around the house, commenting on everything he did in a running commentary that was partly words and partly enthusiastic sound, which Edwin found both exhausting and impossibly dear. He was teaching the boy to walk the fence line of the small property and name the things they passed: the post oak, the live oak, the juniper, the prickly pear, with the same care Florence had brought to the wildflowers, because it seemed important that this child know the land he was standing on. In the summer of 1886, Edwin received a letter from the Ranger headquarters in Austin, the capital, where the commanding general had moved his office, offering him a promotion and a transfer. The posting was for a senior Ranger captain's position in the newly established Indian Territory, along the Red River, where the frontier was still genuinely unsettled, and the work was significant and the need was real. He read the letter twice, and then he sat with it for 2 days before bringing it to Florence, because he knew this was a decision that belonged to both of them, and he needed to have his own thinking clear before he shared it. Florence read the letter at the kitchen table while Henry slept in the back room and Rose was at school, and she read it carefully, the way she read everything, and then she put it down and looked at Edwin with her clear, steady gaze. "What do you want?" she said. "I want to know what you think." "I know that. I'm asking what you want." Edwin considered. "The work is important. I believe in it. But what I have here," he gestured, not specifically at the house, but at everything the house contained, "is more important than the work." Florence nodded slowly. She picked up the letter again. "Indian Territory," she said, "along the Red River. It's still raw out there. It's a different kind of life. I grew up close to the land," Florence said. "You know that. I'm not afraid of a different kind of life." She paused. "Is this what you want to do? Not what you think you should do, what you want?" Edwin was quiet for a moment. He had not, until this conversation, fully separated those two things, and the separating of them took a moment. "Yes," he said, "I believe there's work there that matters. And I think I'd like to show Rose and Henry a larger piece of the world than Harlan Creek." Florence was quiet for a while, looking at the letter, and then she said, "All right. You're certain?" "I'm not certain of anything," Florence said. "But I trust you. And I trust us. And I trust that wherever we are is home, because home is not a place." She folded the letter precisely and slid it back across the table to him. "Write them and say yes." They left Harlan Creek in the October of 1886. 4 years after Florence had arrived on the Del Rio stage, and the departure was attended by more people than Edwin had expected, which said something about how the town had changed its mind about the schoolteacher and the ranger and the life they had built together in the basin. Mrs. Caldwell, who was too old for the sentiment she was displaying, cried openly on the front steps of the schoolhouse and told Florence that she was the finest teacher she had encountered in her career, and that the children of the Indian Territory were very lucky. Florence said that the children of Harlan Creek were the lucky ones, and meant it. They traveled north by wagon, a weeks-long journey through the Texas Panhandle and into the Territory, and the landscape changed around them in ways that Rose cataloged with intense interest, noting the new plant species, the different quality of the light, the shift in the bird populations. Henry, at 3, found the wagon journey to be an extended adventure of unparalleled excellence, and demonstrated this through constant motion and vocalization that both exhausted and delighted his parents in approximately equal measure. The Red River country was as raw as Edwin had described, a wide, rolling land of tall grass prairie and cottonwood-lined creek bottoms and river bluffs that caught the light magnificently in the evening, a land that was still finding its shape between its various peoples and the advancing edge of American settlement, and that carried in it both the beauty and the injustice of the frontier in their full, unresolved complexity. Edwin worked to do his part of that work honestly. He had seen enough by 1886 to understand that the Ranger institution was capable of both protecting ordinary people from genuine violence and perpetuating violence against people who had no protection in law, and he had tried, over his career, to operate consistently on the side of the former and refuse the latter. In the Territory, this took forms that were sometimes uncomfortable, and occasionally required him to file reports that his superiors did not entirely welcome, about incidents that the comfortable version of the history would prefer not to include, and he did this without apology because it was the honest version of the work and the only version he knew how to do. Florence threw herself into the Territory with the same methodical competence she had brought to Harlan Creek. There was no school in their posting, a settlement called Redwater near the river, and within 3 months of their arrival she had organized one, using the meeting room of the trading post on Thursdays and Saturdays, and teaching an assortment of settler children and 2 Chickasaw children whose father had brought them specifically, because he had heard there was a teacher of genuine ability in the settlement. The Chickasaw children, a boy of 9 named Thomas and a girl of 7 named Eliza, were among the most capable students Florence had taught, and she told Edwin in the evenings with the particular satisfaction she always showed when a student surprised her that Thomas had the makings of a serious scholar, and that she intended to write to the mission school about him. Rose, at 9, took to the Territory with the independence of a child who had been raised to trust her own capabilities and curiosity. She made friends with Eliza, who shared her fascination with the natural world, and the 2 girls spent hours exploring the creek bottoms, cataloging plants, bringing home specimens, cross-referencing the Wildflower guide with the new landscape. They found flowers here that were not in the guide, and Rose began a new journal for the Territory species, because the original Harlan Creek journal was becoming a document of home, and she wanted to honor both places separately. The wildflowers in the Indian Territory were different from Texas, taller, bolder, different arrangements of color in the tall grass, and Rose brought them home in the spring of 1887, a great armful of prairie coneflowers and black-eyed Susans and blue wild indigo, and put them in the pitcher on the table in the way that had become family tradition, and Florence stood at the kitchen door of their Territory house, and looked at them with the expression that the wildflowers always produced in her. And then she looked at Rose and said, "You found the right ones." "I know your colors, Mama," Rose said with complete simplicity. Florence sat down rather quickly in the kitchen chair, and Rose looked at her with mild alarm, and Florence said, "I'm fine, sweetheart, I'm very happy." And Rose appeared to accept this, though she watched her mother for the next hour with the careful attention she brought to things that mattered to her. In the summer of 1887, Florence discovered she was expecting again, and this time she was less composed about it than she had been with Henry, or perhaps more honestly expressive, which amounted to the same thing. She told Edwin on the evening of the day she was certain, sitting on the porch of the Territory House with the grassland evening light turning everything gold and amber, and Edwin received the news with the immediate physical response he had perfected sitting down rather suddenly, and then he turned to her with an expression she described later as the most transparent she had ever seen on his face. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. "Good," he said. "That's very good." And he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the grassland evening did its magnificent work around them. This child, born in the early spring of 1888 in the Territory House, with the Red River audible in the distance, was a girl. Florence held her in the thin spring light coming through the window and looked at her with the particular intensity of parents examining new persons, and Edwin stood beside them both with his hand resting on Florence's shoulder and Henry on his other side trying to get a look. They named her Clara. Clara Winslow Keating, because the Winslow carried now not just history but intention. This was who they were, this family, assembled from difficult material into something that held. Rose, at 10.5, accepted her sister with the same proprietary authority she had shown toward Henry, installed herself as an essential part of the childcare operation, and within a week had determined that Clara responded best to the Wildflower names, sung slowly and clearly, which Rose had memorized from the guide and from Florence's teaching. Henry, at 4, regarded his new sister with philosophical uncertainty that lasted approximately 2 weeks before resolving into competitive affection. He was not going to be outdone by Rose in the business of caring about Clara. Edwin watched his family arrange itself around the newest addition and felt the same thing he always felt in these moments, that feeling with no adequate name, the feeling of having arrived somewhere real and meaningful, and of having done so alongside someone entirely worthy of the journey. The Territory years were formative in ways that none of them fully appreciated until they were further from them. The wide sky and the tall grass and the complex, beautiful, troubled reality of the frontier at that particular moment in its history shaped all 3 children, Rose, Henry, Clara, in ways that manifested differently in each of them. Rose's scientific curiosity deepened and clarified into a genuine scholarly passion for botany. Henry developed the practical, physical competence of a child raised close to the land. Clara, growing up between 2 older siblings who both had strong opinions about how the world worked, developed a diplomatic intelligence that her parents recognized early as exceptional. In 1890, Edwin was offered another transfer back to Texas, this time to Austin, to a senior position at the Central Ranger headquarters. He was 39 years old. Florence was 34. Rose was 12. Henry was 7. Clara was 2. They took it. Austin was the state capital, growing, increasingly connected by rail, with a proper university and a school system that had expanded considerably since Florence had attended it as a girl. The reasons were good, but standing on the porch of the Territory House on the last morning before they loaded the wagon, Edwin looked out over the grassland and the cottonwood-lined creek bottom and felt the particular grief of leaving a place that had shaped you, even if the leaving was the right choice. Florence came and stood beside him. She knew what he was feeling because she felt it too, the specific weight of departure. "We've left before," she said. "Yes. And it was right. Yes. This is right too." She put her hand in his. "And we take it with us, the territory, the Red River, all of it." "The wildflowers," he said. She smiled. "Always the wildflowers." Austin received them with the particular commotion of a city that was becoming something, the Capitol building going up on its hill, the streets paved in some sections and muddy in others, the university newly established on its limestone ridge, the whole ambitious project of a young state organizing itself. It was noisier and more various and more complicated than Harlan Creek or the Territory, and all three children responded to it differently: Rose with analytical excitement, Henry with sensory overload that resolved into mastery, Clara with the open, wondering attention of a toddler encountering an enormous world. Florence, in Austin, found her full professional scope. The city school system needed her, needed specifically someone of her combination of experience and academic capability, and within a year of their arrival, she had been appointed Deputy Superintendent of Curriculum for the Austin City Schools, a position that had not previously existed, and that she effectively created through the force of her ideas and her demonstrated ability to implement them. Edwin watched this with profound admiration, and also, he admitted to himself, a sort of joyful amazement, the ongoing revelation of what this woman was capable of when given adequate room. He had seen it in pieces, in Harlan Creek and the Territory, but Austin was the full expression of it, and it was extraordinary. His own work at the headquarters was the work of administration and oversight and the occasional field consultation, less physically dangerous than his prior postings and more intellectually demanding, which suited him at 39 in ways it might not have suited him at 25. He was good at it at the organization and the strategy and the management of a complex institution, and he found in it, somewhat to his surprise, the same sense of meaningful work he had found in the field. Rose, in Austin, found the university. She was 13 when they arrived, too young for enrollment, but the natural history faculty, several of whom were genuine scientists of distinction, received her wildflower journals with a seriousness that she had not encountered before, and one of them, a botanist named Professor Hartley, offered to let her attend his Saturday morning lectures informally, which she did for 2 years before she was formally old enough to enroll. She would enter the University of Texas at 15, one of the youngest students in its history and one of the few women, and would graduate at 19 with a degree in natural science, having published a monograph on the wildflowers of the Red River Basin that drew extensively on the Territory journals she had kept from the age of 9. Florence, on the day Rose's monograph was formally published, a spring day in 1893, with the wildflowers out on the university grounds in their full ridiculous beauty, told her daughter that her grandmother would have been unspeakably proud, and that she was herself more proud than she had words for. And Rose, who was 17 and academically serious and not given to easy sentiment, held her mother's hands and said, "I know, Mama. I know you are." Edwin stood back slightly and let them have the moment, the way he had always known how to do, present but not intrusive, attentive but not consuming. He had learned this from Florence herself, who had taught him without ever making it explicit that love, at its best, was not possessive but generous, that the greatest gift you could give someone was the full freedom of their own capabilities without diminishing your love for them by 1 degree. He had been a good student. Henry, at 12 and 13 and 14, was becoming his own specific person in the active, physical, curious way of a boy growing into himself on the frontier's edge, still riding, still working with his hands, interested in the horses and the cattle and the machinery of the emerging age, and also, to his parents' complicated delight, deeply interested in justice, in the specific questions of who the law protected and who it failed. In the stories Edwin told about the Territory and what had been right and wrong in them. At 17, he told his parents he wanted to study law at the University of Texas, where his sister had blazed the path of possibility. Florence and Edwin received this announcement across the dinner table with the particular parental effort of people who have opinions they are trying not to impose. "Law is important work," Edwin said. "I know," Henry said. "That's why I want to do it." "Your father has some experience with the law's capacity for both good and harm," Florence said carefully. "I know that too," Henry said. That's also why. Edwin looked at his son across the dinner table, at this 7-year-old who had followed him around the territory house making commentary on everything. Now a serious young man of 17 with Florence's eyes and Edwin's jaw, and a moral clarity that appeared to be entirely his own, and felt the specific joy of a parent who sees a child surpass them in something that matters. "Then you should study law," Edwin said. "Thank you," Henry said with dignity. Clara, at 9, watched this exchange with her diplomatic intelligence fully engaged, and then said, "What about me?" And Florence and Edwin both said simultaneously, "What do you want?" And Clara grinned and said, "I want to be a doctor," and the table was briefly very loud. She became one, years later, but that is another story. In the spring of 1895, Edwin Keating was 44 years old. He had been a Texas Ranger for 22 years. He had been Florence's husband for 12. He was the father of 3, Rose, 27 no 17, newly graduated Henry, 12, and Clara, 7. His life had accumulated layers and weight and richness in the way of lives built on genuine choices, and he felt it as a sustaining thing, a structure that supported him through the difficult days and amplified the good ones. He came home on a March evening, one of those March evenings when the Texas Hill Country wildflowers were at their absolute best, when the roadsides ran with purple and gold and blue in bands and sheets of color, with his arms full of coneflowers and black-eyed Susans and chicory, because he had passed a roadside thick with them on his way home, and had stopped the horse and gotten down and gathered them without a second thought, the way he always did, the way he had done every spring since the first one they spent together. He came through the door and called out, and Florence appeared from the kitchen with flour on her hands and that particular expression she wore when she was in the middle of something and slightly exasperated at the interruption. And then she saw the flowers and the expression changed entirely. He held them out. "Your colors," he said. Florence crossed the kitchen with flour still on her hands and took the flowers and put her face into them and breathed deeply. And Edwin watched her, this woman, 12 years of marriage and still the most arresting person he had ever seen, still capable of undoing him entirely with the simple, unguarded act of being moved by something beautiful, and felt the full weight and width of what his life had become. Clara appeared from somewhere behind the kitchen door and looked at the flowers and then at her parents with the clear-eyed assessment of a 7-year-old, who understood the emotional significance of what was happening even if she did not have all the context. "Are those Mama's favorite flowers?" Clara asked. "They're your grandmother's colors," Edwin told her. "Your great-grandmother's, actually. She taught your mama to love them." Clara considered this. "Which grandmother?" "Your mama's mama," Edwin said. "She died before any of you were born, but she knew every flower in Texas by name, and she passed that knowledge to your mama, and your mama passed it to Rose." "And Rose passed it to me," Clara said, with the satisfied tone of someone completing a logical chain. "She taught me the names, on the creek." Florence lifted her face from the flowers and looked at her youngest daughter, and the expression on her face was the one Edwin had catalogued over 12 years as the one that appeared when something reached the deepest part of her. "She did," Florence said. "Last spring," Clara said. "She said you'd be pleased if I knew them." Florence put out her free arm and Clara walked into it, and Florence held her daughter against her side and looked at Edwin over Clara's head with those dark, serious, beautiful eyes. And the full weight of what they had built was present in her face in that moment, the dark past, and the hidden motives, and the forced choices, and the secrets, and the betrayals, and the years of careful survival. And then this. The wildflowers and the children and the man who brought home her colors every spring without being asked, who paid attention, who had understood from the beginning that to love someone fully was to know what they carried and what they inherited and what they passed on, and to treat all of it as sacred. "Edwin Keating," Florence said. "Florence Keating," he said, "come here." He went, as he always went, immediately and completely, and she kissed him with the flowers between them, and Clara made the sound 7-year-olds make at parental affection. And the kitchen was warm, and the spring was outside the window in its fullness. And somewhere in the house Rose was working on her monograph, and Henry was studying his books, and the life that had been built from difficult materials was present and real and good. Later that evening, after dinner, after the children were settled, Edwin and Florence sat on the back porch in the warm March dark, side by side in the way they had sat 10,000 times, her shoulder against his arm, both of them looking out at the Austin sky that was starry and enormous overhead. "Do you remember," Florence said, "the first time you brought me wildflowers?" "March of 1883, Edwin said. "I went down to Harlan Creek before you were awake." "I cried," Florence said. "I know, I saw. I cried because my mother would have loved you," Florence said quietly. "She would have looked at a man who went and gathered her daughter's colors and brought them home, and she would have said exactly the right thing about it. She had a talent for seeing what mattered in a person and saying so." "What would she have said?" Florence was quiet for a moment. "She would have said that you pay attention, which she considered the highest form of love." Edwin was quiet with this for a moment. The spring night held them both, the city sounds distant, the stars very clear. "Your mother was right," he said. Florence laughed softly, the whole laugh, the real one. "She usually was." He took her hand in the dark and held it with the 12 years of everything in the clasp, and she held his back, and they sat together in the Austin spring, with the wildflowers inside in the pitcher on the kitchen table, and the children sleeping in the house behind them, and the whole enormous and specific and irreplaceable fact of their life spread out around them in every direction. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The years continued to do what years do, which is accumulate and transform and reveal. Rose published her monograph and went on to a remarkable career in the nascent field of American botanical science, eventually teaching at the University of Texas, where she had once sat in Professor Hartley's Saturday lectures, as a 13-year-old with her territory journals and her copper hair and her mother's absolute quality of attention. She married at 25, a geologist named Patterson who had the good sense to recognize immediately what he had, and who received Edwin's approval on the basis of the way he listened when Rose spoke, which Edwin considered the essential test. Henry studied law at the University of Texas, graduated with honors, and went into practice in Austin with a particular focus on land rights and the legal claims of people who were frequently denied adequate representation. The Chickasaw and Choctaw families he had known in the territory, the Mexican farmers and ranchers whose land titles were contested, the ordinary people on the wrong end of power for reasons that had nothing to do with right. He was, Florence told Edwin one evening with quiet pride, doing the work the law was supposed to do, the work it too rarely managed. Edwin listened to this and thought about the Chickasaw children Thomas and Eliza, who Florence had taught on the territory, and thought about what was owed, and was glad that his son was among those trying to pay it. Clara, their diplomat and their doctor-in-waiting, followed her declared ambition with the systematic determination she brought to everything, graduating from the University of Texas Medical School, which admitted women in 1897, through a policy change that Clara herself had been instrumental in advocating for, at age 14, in a letter to the dean that the faculty still quoted and practicing medicine in Austin for decades, beloved and formidable in equal measure. Edwin retired from the Texas Rangers in 1899 at 48, after 26 years of service. The retirement ceremony was attended by more people than he expected, including his captain from San Antonio who had ridden up from his own retirement to be there, and who shook Edwin's hand and said that he had done the work the way it ought to be done, and that was not a common thing. Florence was there, in a blue dress the color of chicory, because she had worn it deliberately, and when Edwin saw her across the room, he felt the precise same disruption in his chest that he had felt the first time he saw her, and he had been her husband for 16 years. She caught his eye and smiled at him, full and unhurried, and he crossed the room to her because crossing the room to Florence Keating was the only reasonable response to Florence Keating. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like a beginning," he said, which surprised him as he said it and then seemed entirely correct. "Good," Florence said, "because I have plans for you. Tell me." "The Wildflower Survey," she said. "Rose has been asking me for years whether someone will do a comprehensive survey of the Texas Hill Country species. She needs the data for her expanded work. I intend to do it. And you are going to come with me and carry the specimen boxes and not get bitten by anything." Edwin stared at her. "We'll start in March," Florence said, "when the coneflowers come up." He laughed, which he did more freely now than he had at 31. The years with Florence had opened that up. The years with the children had opened it further, and Florence looked at him with the expression he had tried to name for 17 years and had the best words for now. It was the expression of a woman who had arrived somewhere real and knew it and had no intention of leaving. "March," he agreed. "When the coneflowers come up." And so it was, in the spring of 1900, in the full bloom of the Texas Hill Country, that Edwin Keating, former Texas Ranger, husband, father, man who paid attention, walked through the wildflowers with his wife. The two of them moving through the purple and gold and blue of the coneflowers and the black-eyed Susans and the chicory along the Harlan Creek basin, where everything had started, the same creek he had walked down in March of 1883 to gather the first bunch. Florence moved through the flowers with her specimen book and her collection kit, kneeling, examining, cataloging, as fluent in this language as her mother had been. And Edwin walked beside her carrying the boxes and watching her be brilliant at the thing she loved. And the Texas sky was the same vast blue it had always been, unchanged by any of the human years unfolding beneath it. At some point in the afternoon, Florence stopped and looked around at the field they were standing in, a south-facing slope where the coneflowers grew so thickly you couldn't walk without brushing them, the purple heads nodding in the warm breeze, the gold and blue scattered among them, and she was quiet for a long moment with an expression Edwin recognized. "She walked me through a slope just like this," Florence said. "I was 7. She held my hand and she pointed to each one and she told me the name. She knew every single one. And you told Rose," Edwin said. "And Rose told Clara," Florence said. "And Clara will tell someone." "The chain holds," Edwin said. Florence turned to look at him. Her hair was mostly silver now, though the copper was still in it, and the years were in her face in the way that years in a good face are a kind of beauty rather than a departure from it. And she looked at him with her whole self present in her eyes, no portion of it withheld, the same way she had looked at him in the November darkness of the jail and in the February church and in every kitchen in every house they had ever shared. The same look, continuous and accumulating. "Thank you," she said. "For what specifically?" he said, because with Florence he always wanted to know precisely what was meant. "For all of it," she said. "For the flowers. For coming with me today, for the years, for paying attention." She paused. "For telling Rose that her grandmother picked these colors." He was quiet for a moment in the field in the spring with the wildflowers around them and the sky overhead and the long, specific, irreplaceable life behind and ahead. "She did," he said, "and you picked them up from her, and now they're everywhere." Florence smiled, and it was the real one, the whole one, the laugh adjacent, and she took his hand in the way she had taken it 1,000 times and turned back to the flowers. And Edwin Keating stood beside her in the high, warm Texas spring and was, as he had been for 17 years, entirely and specifically, and completely where he needed to be, holding the boxes, holding her hand, paying attention. The chain held. The wildflowers held. And the colors her mother had chosen: purple for strength, gold for continuing, blue for remembering the sky bloomed year after year across the limestone hills of Texas, carried forward by every person who had received the knowledge and passed it on. The invisible inheritance of a woman none of them had met but all of them knew through the flowers she had named, present in every spring, every field, every daughter who bent to learn the names. Every father who gathered the right colors and brought them home and said, simply and completely. Your mama picked these.